Good evening. HPL is excited to host Jamie Chai Yun Liew and Theresa and Kenney as they discuss Jamie's debut novel, Dandelion. On the right-hand side of your screen is a chat box. Please use this to submit your questions and comments to our presenters. Not only is Jamie an author, but also hosts her own podcast, Migration Conversations, as well as teaching law at the University of Ottawa. Her academic focus is on immigration, refugee, and citizenship law. Jamie is a recipient of the Jim Wong Chu Emerging Writers Award from the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop. In Dandelion, she explores motherhood, family secrets, migration, isolation, and mental illness. And of course, we are also excited to have Theresa joining the talk. She is a PhD candidate and teaching fellow in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. Her research explores asexual, aromantic, and platonic relationships in queer Asian North American cultural production. Her work can be found in Feminist Formations and Decomp Journal, and she has appeared in the Big Sex Talk on CBC Gem as a guest expert on asexuality in so-called Canada. We encourage you to find Dandelion at local independent bookstores like Epic Books at their Locke and Sherman Avenue locations, King West Books in Westdale, The City and City on Ottawa Street, and all retailers that support books and literacy. Finally, before we begin, I will take a moment to acknowledge that the city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. Thank you for joining us, Jamie and Theresa, and also everyone who's joining us for the conversation. I'll turn it over to you, Theresa.
Thank you so much, Megan. Hello, everyone. My name is Theresa. My pronouns are she, her, and it is a privilege to be in conversation with Jamie tonight about her beautiful and brilliant debut novel, Dandelion. Jamie, welcome virtually to Hamilton. Thank you for sharing your evening with us.
Theresa, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be with you. I just wanted to also acknowledge that my pronouns are she, her, and that I'm speaking today with you from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories here in Vancouver.
Thank you. So before we jump into hearing an excerpt from the book, I was wondering if you could give us a bit of context about how the book came about and what we should keep in mind as you read your excerpt.
So thank you for asking that. My book was a product of a lot of research I had been doing at the time on stateless persons and migrants. And a lot of the research I collected captured a lot of the emotions, psychological experiences of migrants and stateless persons. And I wanted to explore some of those themes and feelings a little bit more. The excerpt I'm going to be reading you today is situated in landscape. And the reason why I do that is because this book is very Canadian. It's situated on Turtle Island, but most importantly, I wanted to interrogate how the landscape can resemble home for some people, loss for some people. And it riffs off of a friend of mine's art, Don Kwan. I had the pleasure of hosting a book launch with him in Ottawa last week, and his work called Landscape, Loss and Legacy at the Ottawa Art Gallery had me thinking about how our work dovetailed really nicely. And I wanted to share an excerpt that showed the dichotomous experiences one can experience in being here as a migrant. I also just wanted to say that the book, where I'm going to be starting is, the story is about a young woman who has a baby and thinks back to her childhood about why is it that her mother disappeared when she was a child, and she relives some of the experiences that her Mother experienced living in a small town in BC. And where I'm beginning there on a family vacation in British Columbia and Alberta. The next morning, we were awoken by the cool mountain air and the cawing of crows. After breakfast, Father drove onto Highway 6 towards Waterton Lakes National Park. Father had decided we would do a day hike on Roe Lakes Trail. The trail cut through a dense wilderness along the banks of Roe Creek before connecting to two different lakes along the path. We climbed uphill, Mount Lynam and Mount Roe guiding us. The stillness of the lakes below made me feel both tiny and large at the same time. Tiny because of the vastness of the valley, the calm lake framed by the mountains. Large because I had conquered the trail with my two legs. We took in the view awestruck. Despite it being the height of summer, snow-capped peaks rose from the rolling grasslands. Red flowers of Indian paintbrush dotted the foothills. In the distance, along the rocky edges of the mountain base, Arctic poppies drank in the sun, their pale yellow petals framing their black and gold faces. Beyond them, bare grass bloomed. It looked like a field of white ghosts made of shining diamonds, welcoming the royal poppies to the mountains, inviting them to be plucked. I was afraid that if I blinked, the flowers would be blown away by the wind. I watched my parents pause to look around. I had never seen them so stunned. I didn't think anything grew around here other than grass and pine trees, Father marveled. It doesn't look real, Mother commented. It's beautiful, Father said. No, look at the water. It looks unnatural. The flowers, they look fragile, like they will break and fly away. The flowers back home are bigger and last longer. All kinds of lotuses, frangipani, hibiscus. They're hardier and brighter. It's different, allowed Father. Mother looked away from the calm, quiet landscape and fiddled with her scarf. The beauty of the valley charmed me. I wanted Mother to share my delight in the grass dancing beside me. Don't you like it here? I asked. She swiveled her jade bracelet, encircling the cuff of her sleeve, and muttered, It doesn't matter. Mother wrapped her cream-colored cardigan firmly around her shoulders, buttoning it up. After her sweater, she fidgeted with her socks, rubbing her ankle briskly before pulling them up higher. Perhaps she was really just adjusting to the cool breeze, but I saw a person who didn't want to admit the scene was beautiful, that it was worthy of her attention. Doesn't the water look like a mirror, Mom? I tried again. Dingue, fake. Don't let it fool you. Things probably can't survive there. Back home, the ocean is where we harvest things, where the most delicious food is. What about the grass? Doesn't it look soft, like you could sleep in it? Don't be silly, Lily. It's too cold to sleep here. Back home, you could sleep outside. It's warm enough. I felt like I couldn't enjoy the scene before me without betraying Mother's love for her nature and her homeland. She made me feel as if I was doing something treasonous. Let's go, she said. We don't have all day and it will be dinner time soon. Father pulled out his camera and asked Mother to pose in front of the lake. I wanted her to tilt her head like I saw her do in the pictures of her youth, but she said, I don't feel like having my picture taken. Father snapped a photo of her anyways, settling for the frown on her face. To make Father feel better, I asked him to take a picture of me. When we returned to our van from the 5-hour hike, we were exhausted and hungry. Mother pulled out the hibachi and made some ikan bakar from provisions she had picked up in Pincher Creek. She dropped the tilapia she brought live onto her wooden cutting board and struck its head with a mallet. The fish's flapping body went limp. She quickly scaled and gutted it. She made it look so easy. I couldn't help blurt out, Ew, gross. Where do you think your food comes from? She said. It's fresh and extra delicious this way. Bea and I watched Mother smother the fish with a sambal of shallots, shrimp paste, chilies, and lemongrass, and then place it in some banana leaves inside a grill basket. Father discovered some watercress in the creek nearby, and Mother happily decided to make a soup to accompany our dinner. Since Bea had taken my book, I joined Mother in the makeshift kitchen and helped her cut ginger and place it in the pot of water. Father was looking at a map of Waterton and suggested other hikes we could do the next day, but Mother said, we just did a hike today. Do we have to do another? Sweet Hua, each one is different. Don't you want to see more of what we saw today? Father asked. That was enough for me, Mother replied. How about a shorter one? Father offered. You can go with the girls if you want. I'll stay here. But Mom, I interjected. This is supposed to be a family vacation. You can't stay here. Besides, there's nothing fun to do here. Come on the hike with us. It's going to be more of the same, Mother said. I thought about Mother's superstitious ways. Maybe she felt there was some home out there that wasn't right for her. After dinner, I could see Mother and Father in the distance. Mother was moving her arms wildly, and Father was looking at his feet. He raised his head, trying to interrupt. I felt my back clench. I hated seeing Mother unhappy. The argument ended abruptly when she stormed off into the desk. It was dark before she returned. She looked like Ikui, the hungry ghost who roams the streets like a shadow, her long black hair resting over her shoulders and back, searching for sustenance, but finding only what is rotten. When the light revealed it was Mother, she was still sullen. We acted as if nothing had happened and crawled into the van. As Father snored, Mother sat upright, stroking her ankle, as if she had tested it too much during the day's hike. I fell asleep, watching her knead her foot with a steady force. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. I particularly love this section in Dandelion, and we've talked about this a bit, partly because it's among the landscape that I'm quite familiar with in the Kekutuna territories, which you mentioned in an earlier chapter. And also Waterton was like one of my first vacation memories as a child. So like not only is it just a beautiful chapter, it resonated so much for me. But I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about, the nuances of Asian experiences of migration and language in so-called Canada, especially considering this month is Asian Heritage Month. And I'm thinking about homelands and land itself, and how migration brings us in between homeland. And maybe this is a spoiler for the audience, but there's a travel back to Southeast Asia, to Brunei. Where could we dive into that a bit together to think about homeland?
Yeah, I think one of the things I tried to convey in Dandelion was that this particular family were, their circumstances were born out of British colonization, both in Southeast Asia and in Canada. And I really wanted to show how, wherever they went, it was there. It was ubiquitous. I can't say that word right now, but, it was ever present and it affected their psyche, and I think the landscape resembles to me this kind of different experiences, both in the awe and wonder of discovering something new and resembling that risk that migrants take to go somewhere completely different and not know what will face them. But on the other hand, to have this kind of, to feel so foreign, to be in a place where you don't understand how things exist, how things function, and why they are the way they are, right? So I feel like the landscape for me resembled this kind of dual experience of just, highlighting difference, highlighting stark contrasts between homeland and new places, but also that wonder and that amazement and the resilience that people have in the fact that they can look around them and say, I've made it and I've arrived, kind of thing, So yeah, I think in some ways I feel like the landscape in different places played as separate characters than the core characters that you read about in the story.
Yeah, and I love the section that you read for us because it draws parallels between the mother's memories. That migration carries with it memories of home, and how do you situate and make a life in so-called Canada when there's something about comparison that will always kind of be part of growing up. And as someone who is a second generation Asian Canadian, like I see how those memories of home are passed down intergenerationally, and that's something that's really key in this entire book is the intergenerational relationships. How do you see migration, and those intergenerational relationships playing out?
I think that's a really important thing. And I think people take for granted that, if you're born and raised here, that you don't necessarily carry with you any of the things that your parents may have experienced. But I think anybody who has children begins to realize that they see and hear things more than you think they do. And then sometimes they reveal and you're like, oh, I can't believe they were listening, or I didn't realize they understood what I was talking about. And I think, you know, um, part of the story is about this intergenerational trauma, and the different ways in which migrants experience migration. Different characters in the book experience migration as hopeful, as a new beginning, and others feel, you know, a sense of loss and grief, right? And I think, in the main character, Lily, her parents resemble those two ends of the spectrum in a very distinct and stark way. And I wanted to pay homage to that because I think not everybody experiences migration that way. And we often see Canada celebrating, immigrant success and immigrant stories about, oh, so and so's father was a taxi driver, but now look at their daughter. She's, a doctor. And I think that's a very simplistic way, and that there's costs borne to that. But also, for those of us that did succeed, and our parents are proud of us, I think we also carry some of that trauma, and it's not always evident or visible. And I guess I would just say that it became more apparent to me after I wrote the book too, and during the pandemic, especially for people in our, your community and my community, just walking down the street sometimes felt very precarious because of the rise of anti-Asian hate and violence that had been occurring during the pandemic. And I've certainly experienced that during the pandemic. And it's really interesting that, for me, growing up, I thought, oh, my parents are experiencing that because they have an accent or they weren't born here, and that I had assumed I would escape all of that. But it's interesting to live in a time like now, like we are today, where racism in a way has reared its ugly head in a more forceful way. And it's triggered very interesting memories of my childhood and emotions that I saw my parents go through, but I scoffed at as a child and didn't appreciate, right? And I don't know, Theresa, if you experienced the same thing, especially in the last few years.
Definitely over the past few years. Like you said, there are ways that maybe the past 2 years have shown even more how anti-Asian racism is alive and well, unfortunately. But it also has been an interesting reflection time to realize how important those ways of being, in my case, Filipinx, how being Asian and being Filipinx is a guiding thing in my life. And I think it's easy for us to say, there are so many problems in the world, and there are, but it's by being Asian in the world that I get to live it in a very unique and specific way, where that trauma, as much as it comes with me, is something that I get to do in kinship with my community. And I think your book does a wonderful job of conveying across different communities, whether it's in Canada or once in Brunei, of the ways that different voices carry stories. But I was thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about how those traumas are related to that colonialism that you were talking about, and how in this case, and I understand in your own personal life, statelessness became a key kind of factor to creating the narrative for this book. And I think about how statelessness, what happens when you end up in a state and you've done the migratory work. And I'm just thinking about that as we're having this conversation of where does the violence begin, where does it end, and does the past 2 years just draw even more emphasis on long histories of violence?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that. So, the research that I was working on is inspired by the fact that my father was born stateless in a country called Brunei. They didn't give citizenship to Chinese people. And and he was born in that country, and it's hard to understand, but a lot of countries don't give citizenship automatically, and they don't give citizenship to people just because they were born within their territory. And for much of his life, he was without citizenship, without a home, until he immigrated to Canada. And I thought his situation was unique or anomalous until I started becoming a lawyer and researching this area and discovered that there are millions of people around the world that are stateless. And I went back to Southeast Asia to do some research in Malaysia in particular, to talk to stateless persons and to understand or to try to figure out why is it that statelessness still exists? What are the legal barriers? And it's really interesting because in my point of view, it's really a colonial vestige of how racialized categories of people were created in British colonial times, of how different groups of people were given more privilege or access to different opportunities or resources, and others were not. And this carried over in the building of the constitutions of various countries, including how do we determine who is a citizen. And in Malaysia, it's remarkably race-based, even though people might assume everyone is Asian there. And so, I talked to a lot of people there about what it felt like, and so many people conveyed to me, how is it that I'm a foreigner in my own home? And that is one of the I would say one of the themes I wanted to carry through Dandelion, because here we have Lily. Her father never felt at home in the place of his birth, the place where he grew up, because of a lack of legal status. Yet he travels all the way to Canada, finally carries that coveted status of citizenship, and yet struggles to feel at home there. And we see this manifest the most in the character of Sui Hua, I think, because she, really is resentful about the fact that it isn't so easy, or that it doesn't feel comfortable or familiar, or that people aren't as welcoming. And I think here again, the colonial history of Canada, the ways in which immigration law prevented Chinese women, Chinese people from coming as freely as other migrants, really affects the way in which Chinese people are looked upon. We're always going to be assumed as foreigner, because it was always assumed that we were not in the same rank or category as other migrants, right? So I think, this the idea of home and belonging and citizenship, to me, stems from legal structures and the ways in which the law can communicate to people how to treat other people. And I tried to, while that's present in the story, I also wanted to play with the emotions that come with that, and how it really affects people in their day-to-day existence and lives.
I just enjoy that like deep dive into the emotional daily experience of being, part of the group, but also not, and the way that citizenship plays out. But I also really enjoyed the way that you described familiarities, because it's something that, again, like, I found this book so familiar in some ways because of the settings, or because of the way that you particularly write about food. And you do a fantastic thing about food throughout the book, but in this section that you've read for us, there's something about the familiarities that even in the middle of, Canadian mountain ranges, tilapia and shrimp paste and banana leaves still make their way through. And this past semester, I taught a week about why we need to pay attention to food in Asian North American literature. And weeks later, my students were like, I've never thought this much about food, like, ever in my life. But reading your book made me have that revelation again of, oh, there's something really intentional and inviting for not just, the everyday reader, but for folks like me who think about banana leaves or have haw flakes as their snack. And it does this incredible job of recalling memories and senses or emotions that you were talking about. And I know that food plays a big role, because maybe our audience should know there's great dumpling videos of Jamie on the internet of how to make dumplings. Could we talk a bit about food in Asian life and why food plays such a prominent role in the book?
Yeah, I think food is it's like one of the joys of life. And I love food. I love eating. I love cooking when I have the time. And for me, I mean, I grew up at a time where, where there wasn't a lot of, you know, Chinese. I lived in a place where there wasn't a lot of Chinese people around. There wasn't a Chinatown. And so for me, my mother's cooking was a way for me to connect with my culture. It was a way for me to feel at home. And it was comforting. Like a lot of people talk about comfort food. Yeah, we have comfort food as well. And it's unfamiliar to you, but it's very familiar to us, right? And I think food is, for me, is the trigger for Lily. It's like that gateway to her discovering her identity more because it's already familiar to her and it evokes memories and it's something that she can't escape, right? But more than that, I think food is there's so many interesting things about food. And I'm so glad you noticed it because I really did curate, the selection of there's so much food I could have put in that I didn't put in, but I had to make really deliberate choices and I did. And I deliberately include the ingredients so that people can become familiar with it. But one of the things I want people to know too is that, Chinese food is very varied as well. Like the Chinese food I eat is different from the food that Cantonese or Mandarin speakers eat. And the food that my parents grew up with is fusion in Southeast Asia. There's Indian influences, Malay influences, indigenous influences from the region, from Iban populations, for example. And so the food that I ate is not necessarily the same as the food that, my Chinese friends ate when I was growing up. And I wanted to showcase that a bit. I wanted to, I have some pride in the food that we eat because I actually do think it's one of the best in Asia, not to be a snob, but so I wanted to tell people about it and I want to share it. And I also feel very strongly about how it depicts migration as well. The fact that Indonesian, Filipino, Malay, Indian cuisine is all mixed together in that region because of British colonizers who brought migrants over to work in plantations, to work in the markets, to work as merchants, to work as fishermen. And so the food is part of the story. The food carries another layer of the historical backdrop to what is happening in that family. And I think for me, food is like music. It triggers memories. And I used it as a vehicle to do that for Lily in a lot of ways. So yeah, thank you for noticing.
What is like, and maybe this is off the top of your head, what is like the recipe or the food that you included that you're so happy that you included in Dandelion? For me, it was the haw flakes, and how there's a scene in the book where that's the like treat that gets passed on to friends. And I think about that as like a childhood snack that not many folks know of as a regular thing, and that was a big deal for me. But what was yours?
You know what? I love that you say that because recently I introduced my kids to haw flakes because I was like, oh, I grew up with this all the time, and I didn't want my kids to miss out, and so they are now huge fans of it, and it makes me so happy that I know there's a ton of sugar in it probably, but I give it to them whenever they want because I want them to have those memories too. Like, and the fact that you said that, it's so nice to hear from people in my own community who recognize that. I did do that for a reason, to pay homage to our own childhoods, right? To have that nostalgia, because a lot of people have told me, oh, doesn't that remind you of our childhood? And I'm like, no, it doesn't, because my childhood was a little bit different. So in some ways, I'm also, wanting to have some imprint of some nostalgia from our childhood too. So thank you for saying that. But in terms of food, I mean, one of my favorite dishes that's in the book is called Chocoyao, and it is cooked in a hot wok with rice flat noodles, with cockles and with beans and seafood, an egg, and it's cooked very rapidly and quickly, and it's quite fatty because it's meant for workers that were working in the mine or in the plantations. It was a quick lunch, but it's very, very delicious, and it just melts into your mouth. And so yeah, that's one of the dishes that I personally love eating whenever I can. I cook it at home. In Asia, it's the most amazing hawker food that you can find, and it has a lot of historical presence due to what was happening in the region at the time. So I really, that dish resembles a lot for me.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think the audience needs to like really understand that if there's anything that I took away from the book that I didn't expect to take away from the book, it was how hungry I got from the delicious like descriptions that you put throughout it. And I appreciate that I now know the favorite option that was in it. I guess part of what else I wanted to talk about was about food. Was what does it mean for that to be an intergenerational moment? Like in the excerpt that you had, it's a moment where the mother is cooking, and there's like it's almost like an audience of the family being part of it. What are your thoughts on the roles that food has, not just as memory, but as like cultural movement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think, in different parts of the book, the food also is kind of ceremonial or ritual, and, one of my most favorite parts of the book actually is when Lily's father is cooking, right? And how it's different from her mother's and distinct, and how she notices that. And also how her father, despite the fact that he is the character that resembles or symbolizes efforts to assimilate, he still practices the ritual of cooking this dish for new mothers, which is called jugai. It's like a ginger chicken dish that's meant to be for new mothers to help them heal from childbirth and to give them sustenance to feed their babies. And I think of food as that too, as ways to mark occasions, as rituals to pass on. And and you see this, like he does this several times in the book, right? And he cooks the same dish several times for different people. And I think that to me resembled that continuation, right? And that how food moves and through the generations. But then I also hope that people see that food is constantly changing too, that there isn't like one authentic way to do things, and that different communities have different ways of cooking the same dish, right? And even Lily acknowledges that she might do things a little bit differently, and I think especially Southeast Asia, where the food I bring into the book, they're a product of evolution and fusion. And so, I hope that people understand that food's not static too. It's almost a reflection of the time that it's created in, right?
That is like the most incredible segue to something that I've been thinking about, is that our kind of through line, other than we both love food, is that there's overlaps obviously shared between Southeast Asian and Canadian experiences. And, there's a thrill for me of reading something that knows the Calgary Center Street Lions so well. And for folks who will hopefully read the book, there's just like the best kinds of imagery about BC and Alberta, but also Southeast Asia throughout Dandelion. In some ways, it feels like the most beautiful love letter to those landscapes and those peoples. But at the same time, Dandelion does this really important work of naming differences between us as Southeast Asian people, but also just between folks of Chinese descent. So I like this is why your answer was so perfect for the question that I have of what does it mean to you as a Hakka, Hainanese, Nyanya person with those roots, to have a book in this world that speaks to that heterogeneity of Asian ways of living in North America.
Thank you for saying that. And I think you must experience this too, because I feel like Filipinos sometimes get lumped in with Asians, and yet people default to thinking it's Chinese, right? So,
yes.
I mean, I've never felt that I belonged in the mainstream Chinese identity in Canada. You know, there was a lot of people understand Chinese Canadian to be Mandarin or Cantonese speaking people from China or Hong Kong. And they don't know that there's hundreds of dialects out there, right? Or they might see Chinese people as immigrating generations ago through the head tax and their ancestors built the railway. So I don't fit into those ideas of the mainstream Chinese. And I have to confess that, you know, in some ways it was isolating, you know, to belong to a community that people thought you belonged to, but that you didn't really feel 100% connected to. Obviously, there are similarities. I have tons of Chinese friends that speak Cantonese and Mandarin. So, but there are differences, and I want people to know that. I want people to know that within our community, we have different experiences, different cuisine, different languages, and that when I was growing up, it was not uncommon to sit around a family table where 5 dialects were being spoken across the table, depending on who you're talking to. And my father speaks Hakka, my mom speaks Hainan. You know, I have relatives who speak Cantonese and Mandarin, and then there's English. There's literally 5 different languages being thrown across the table. So it wasn't uncommon for me to see that, but I know for some other Chinese, I've talked to a lot of my Chinese friends who say, no, that's not common in my family. Like it was just Cantonese or just Mandarin. And and so I think there's richness and diversity. And that's why I felt like it was important to write about it, because first of all, I want people to know about it, but second, I also wanted to, my book, I consider it a little bit of light historical fiction, and I wanted to kind of imprint that difference in the Canadian landscape, I guess.
And I think you do that. In the best ways. It goes against what you expect an Asian Canadian novel to do, because it takes you into an often neglected storyline and narrative and people and culture. I don't think many folks know about Hakka as a unique ethnic language group, and then to think about it as something that as a group of people who migrate to Canada. And I think that's what makes this book so exciting, is that it is a magnificent example of caring for others in your community, caring for others intergenerationally, caring across Southeast Asian and also just broader Asian groups, but also for ourselves. I think that's what made the book so exciting for me, is that you could tell that it was a book full of care for even the reader to sit with.
Thank you for saying that. That means a lot to me.
Yeah, like you, and I bring that up because so often we think of difference as something that's not good, you know, that we should be bonded together over the things that we do share. And yet your book does the important work of recognizing those who for so long don't get to have that light history or in Canada. And so I guess I'm just wondering if you could keep diving into what it means to have a light history. Like I love the way that you describe that, because this book can now be a resource in some ways for those who need to learn about your communities, but also for the communities that you're part of.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because I think also one of the things that I think you mentioned was that I think there's a tendency for people to sometimes essentialize or view groups of people as the same and having the same culture and the same experiences. And, even within, I also made some deliberate language choices in the book, in the sense that I throw some Chinese characters in there, but I also throw in only the traditional version versus the simplified version, because I'm, nodding to the political aspirations of Hong Kong, for example, and knowing that there is conflict within our Asian communities, right? That there is an imperial colonizing power of China that continues to do it through language to try to erase the existence of other languages, so to speak. So in some ways, I'm trying to reclaim that space by saying, hey, we're still here. We still speak these languages, but at the same time, by only smattering a few characters in, I also wanted to show that shared experience of people like me who were raised in Canada but might have a loss of language as well, that I only know a little bit of my mother tongue. And it's because of this assimilating force of privileging the English language in order to succeed in our society. And so, that I think understanding that there's differences within our communities, there's conflict, there's differences of opinion about what it means to be loyal to the Chinese culture and identity versus also the struggles that we have to preserve whatever language and culture we have in an environment like Canada.
I so appreciate that response because one of the things that I learned this semester with teaching those students is how complex Asian North American literature is, how complex Dandelion is, and how often the imaginary of what Asian, Canadian literature looks like is associated to the traumas of long histories of things like the Chinese head tax or Japanese internment, which are key and important. But we forget the small nuances of complexity of just living, in 21st century Canada. It makes it sound like I'm not trying to neglect those histories, but sometimes we forget the complexity of what literature now can offer us. And I think that you described that so beautifully of and the loss of language in particular is something that I'm sitting with because, like you, I also had multiple dialects or multiple languages happening across the dinner table at a time. And I can't speak like those dialects. And I'm thinking about, pan Filipino languages, but also the ways that the expectation that English and Anglophone speakers just happens across Asian. Like once you've migrated, the expectation is that you do lose that in the assimilation process. So thank you. You've left me kind of without words, even though I'm talking, because I haven't sat to really think about those things before.
Yeah, no, and I think it's important to acknowledge, like, I just think also, in my own experience when I speak to family and friends in Asia, I mean, they all speak English, and it's really interesting how the prominence of this colonial language has jeopardized, I guess I would say, the persistence of our language, and I in some ways, Dandelion is a lament to that for me, because it is increasingly difficult as an adult to recapture that, and also the realization that my kids probably will have less of that than me, because of the fact that I don't have the same kind of understanding I did as a kid, or because my parents, prioritized English in the home later in life. Yeah.
Before we keep talking, I'm going to invite folks in the audience to start using the Q&A chat option, just so that we can start curating a bunch of questions for Jamie. So you're welcome to use the the Q&A function, and I will read the questions aloud. It's just a prompt to let that happen. But also, Jamie, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about your, like, if there was a place in the book that you say, this is what I would like you to pay attention to, or like, this is something that means a lot to me. What is something that us as readers, if you could pick kind of one or two moments in the book, is there one that would entice us to really sit with it and enjoy it?
Yeah, there's a few instances. Oh my goodness, that's a really hard question and very thoughtful. I guess, without, giving away spoilers of the book, I guess I would say is, we're in a moment, especially in the Canadian context, we're a moment in time where I feel that there are people who are nevertheless always going to be felt or treated like foreigners, even though they've done everything they can to belong. Like they were born here, speak the language, practice the customs, perform sameness, in certain contexts. But yet it's, simply because of the way we look, that we're being treated differently. And I think this is a moment to really talk about that, because not just because of the microaggressions that maybe you and I experience, but also I'm thinking about, for example, I live in Ottawa, and across the river in Quebec, there is Bill 21, which is a bill that restricts women who wear the hijab to work and to do certain things in Quebec. They can't act as teachers, daycare workers, various other kind of public service jobs. And to me, that resembles that no matter what you do, you're never going to be treated like you're fully welcomed as you are, And I think it's a moment in time for me to hope that when people read this, they understand what people go through when they're told, do this and then we'll accept you. But then it's not enough. Now do this, now do this. And the costs it has for those people to have to sacrifice or to struggle with those decisions or to resist, and I see some characters in the book going along with that and others really resisting and not accepting what is being asked of them. And it comes from the top. I think I've said this earlier, that the law really shapes the way we think of other people. The law shapes how we talk about people. And I hope that this book really allows people to question, but also to discuss the ways in which our communities are either welcoming or not welcoming.
So fabulous. Thank you. I'll start with the questions, if that's okay with you, Jamie.
Yes.
There's a question from Charlotte, and Charlotte says, Jamie, can you elaborate on your writing process? What's the difference between writing a novel and a podcast?
Oh, very different. A podcast, I feel like it's just more of a conversation. And so in some ways, the focus is on, I usually invite guests that are very interesting to me, or I know have a story that needs to be told. And so for me, it's just a matter of bringing that out and writing questions that can bring the best out of that person. But writing a novel is, a complete clean slate. So it's, I have something to work with in a podcast, whereas I don't have anything to work with in a novel. And in some ways I found that quite liberating, and I do find legal writing, academic writing, there's so many rules about what to include and how to cite things and what counts as research, what counts as data. But a novel, there's no boundaries, right? So I did find that this was a perfect vehicle to use things that I couldn't use in other places. And I found that quite cathartic, to be honest.
This is a similar question from Marie, or related. Jamie, did you decide to write a novel because you felt like you wanted to be a novelist? Did you feel like there was a gap in Can Lit? And what led you to fiction?
So that's a really great question. I did not seek out to be an author. I actually wanted to write to see if I could. So at first it was an experiment to see if I would enjoy it. I felt like I had a story to tell and I had material within me that I wanted to explore. So when I wrote it, the first draft, I didn't tell anybody except, those very like 2 or 3 people, the 2 or 3 people closest to me. And so when I finished the draft and when I happened to win the ECWW's Emerging Writer Award, I suddenly was outed that I was a writer. And I didn't seek out to fill a gap or to establish myself as a writer. I mainly did it for myself. And if anything else, I knew at the time the risks and the hardships that writers go through, that sometimes they don't get published, the rejections they receive. And so in some ways I kind of wrote it for myself and for my kids, but also I was like, if it does get published, it's because I felt like there's something to be told there, right? And this might seem kind of silly, but I did, before reading the book, read Crazy Rich Asians by Kevin Kwan. And it's like a very silly rom-com. But the book really lit a fire under me because he inserted Hokkien words in it, which is in my book as well. And I was thinking while reading it, oh my gosh, if he can write a book with Hokkien in it and get away with it, then why couldn't I? Right? So for me, it was not really filling a gap, but also going, oh my gosh, I can do this too. And I have a lot to say about that. And I have a story and I want to do it. And I feel really privileged and lucky that it is published now, that people can read it and it can be shared.
It's like you knew the question that was coming up next. Lois asks, what are you reading now, or what were you reading that helped you inspire Dandelion?
Yeah, that was one of the books. I don't know if people don't have a copy of the book, on the back of the book, it has these blurbs, and these are the authors that I admire so much. And I feel really lucky that I had an excuse to contact them and say, can you blurb my book? So, before, I'll just read their names: Catherine Hernandez, who wrote Scarborough, Carrie Ann Leung, who wrote The Wanderer's Woo, and Jenny Hagen Wills, author of Older Sister, Not Necessarily Related; Lindsay Wong, author of The Woo Woo, How I Survived Ice Hockey, Drug Raids, Demons, and My Crazy Chinese Family. I'm a huge fan of my peers, of Asian Canadian writers before me, women who tell very brave stories and who are feisty and sassy in doing so. And so I'm really inspired by that. And I honestly have to say that it really, for me, and I know it's not the same for other authors, but for me, representation matters. Like, if it wasn't for them, I don't know if I would have had the courage. Like, I'm not I don't take a lot of risks. So it was because I saw a lot of these women writing boldly that I thought I could do that too. And so I highly recommend reading these authors. I also, just women of color, like, for example, Francesca Akuyesi. She wrote Butter Honey Pig Bread. She also writes a lot about food in her book, which really inspired me as well. And there's a lot of great Canadian authors, too many to name, but women of color who are writing right now, I think it's such a privilege that I don't have time to read everything out there. But yeah, I'm inspired by those kinds of stories.
Great recommendations ahead. Like, read Dandelion and then read the folks who are on the back of the book as well. There is a compliment from Annie, who says, thank you for this talk. And Annie also asks, how do you develop your characters?
That's a really good question. So I have to confess that this book, I did not outline or plan. I kind of pantsed it, as they say in the writing world. I literally sat down and just started typing whatever came to my head. And, the character of Lily, I think, I wrote it at a time when my kids are quite young. And so I was, I have very conflicting feelings about early motherhood, women who have babies. Like, it is a nice and wonderful time, but it's also very difficult. And so I wrote at a time where I was feeling those same feelings, and so Lily comes out of that, out of my own worries and angst about being a new mother. And I use that trope of isolation, loneliness of becoming a new mother to parallel the journey that her mother Sui Hua experiences as a migrant in Canada. And I found it very similar in some respects, and use those two experiences to kind of bridge or bring Lily and her mother together in the story. So that's how those characters developed. And I would say Sui Hua also is kind of a nod to some of the feminist literature that I love. For example, Sarah Ahmed. I love her work on the killjoy, and I kind of view Sui Hua as a killjoy in the book, in the sense that she resembles outwardly this beautiful, fragile, ornamental Asian woman, but really she is not at all what you think. She's not docile. She's not going to listen to what people tell her to do. She's not going to sit down and perform. She's going to, she kind of resists and breaks away from that, right? And I feel like she's always the one that disrupts the conversation, or invites people to think about, why do I have to put up with that? Why do I have to do this? Why do I have to stay here even? Do you know what I mean? So I think for me, she appears to be that typical Asian stereotype, but she performs the killjoy in the book. So that's where my inspiration for her came from.
What a wonderful way to describe her. Because yes, she's the best kind of feminist killjoy. In our last few minutes together, the last question is from Marie. Will you write another novel?
Yes, I am in the midst of trying to write a second novel, but it's so true what people say. People say, oh, the first novel is easier to write than the second. And, I think when I wrote the first novel, I was a secret writer. Nobody knew I was doing it, and there was no pressure. And now I have so many ideas. I actually have ideas for 3 books, but I just don't know how to harness these ideas or where to begin. And so I am in the midst of doing it. I have to say the pandemic ruined a lot of my writing plans. And, I was living in Ontario where there was a lot of school closures. So I hope to be back at it soon. And yeah.
Well, I can tell you that I am looking forward to it. If Dandelion is any testament to the amazing writing that you will keep offering to Asian Canadian literature, tonight has been a very big honor to sit and think with you about these topics, about the book itself. And on behalf of all of us, I just want to thank you for spending time with us, to diving into your book with us.
I just want to thank you, Theresa, for your extremely thoughtful questions. It's been so nice talking to someone who's read the book and who has really deep and caring thoughts about it. So thank you so much for spending time with me.